The Galactic Council's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating humans. It was thinking they could control them. At first, the idea seemed harmless enough. Humanity, a late addition to the grand cosmic stage, had been invited into the Union under the polite but condescending classification of a Tier 3 auxiliary species. That was just a fancy way of saying, "You're cute, but don't touch the controls." The Union had classified humans as strategically insignificant and lacking the intellectual discipline for large-scale warfare. So naturally, they decided to teach humans how to fight. It wasn't charity, it was desperation. The war with the Zelthar Dominion had been dragging on for nearly a century, and the Union, despite its vast fleets, bureaucratic precision, and deeply held belief in its own superiority, was getting its collective ass handed to it. The Zelthar were brutal, efficient, and worst of all, unpredictable. Union fleets followed perfect battle doctrine, adhering to centuries of tactical tradition, while the Zelthar laughed in the face of such predictability and blew them to bits. So, some genius in the high command had an idea. Let's use humans. They're expendable, eager, and probably too primitive to question orders. Enter Commander Elias Rourke. He wasn't special, at least not according to Union standards. Just another ambitious officer in Earth's Space Corps, plucked from a small military exchange program and thrown into the galactic war machine like a spare cog. Elias had been thrilled at first. This was humanity's big break, a chance to prove themselves among the stars. Then he actually met his new commanding officers. Admiral Vorsk was a towering, four-eyed Thalaxian who looked like a half-melted wax figure but somehow managed to radiate an aura of smug disapproval at all times. The Union's training sessions consisted of lectures so mind-numbingly dull that Elias was certain they were banned under the Geneva Conventions. The strategy briefings were worse, giant holograms of battles, narrated in monotone by a species whose idea of tactical flexibility was deciding whether to fire before or after tea time. It was painfully obvious why the Union was losing. Elias sat through hours of doctrine, explaining that every engagement must be fought with graceful precision and statistical inevitability, which was a fancy way of saying, if the enemy does A, we respond with B, and if they do C, we just pretend they didn't. Any deviation was considered unprofessional. You will memorize these sequences, Vorsk had droned during their first tactical briefing. Deviation from protocol results in inefficiency. Inefficiency leads to failure. Failure leads to the destruction of Union order. Elias raised a hand. What if the enemy doesn't follow the script? Vorsk blinked his 4 eyelids in slow, deliberate disappointment. Then they are illogical. Elias glanced at the battle record. The Zelthar had won every major engagement for the past 20 years. Seems like they don't have a problem with illogic, he muttered. That earned him an extra 3 hours of efficiency training. Still, Elias played along. He saluted when required, nodded at the right moments, and kept his more colorful thoughts to himself. He had been assigned to the USS Renegade, a sleek but outdated destroyer attached to the 14th Fleet, along with a handful of other human officers. The ship's crew was mostly composed of Union veterans, officers who had spent decades following every regulation, every protocol, every mind-numbing strategic formula, and they were about to get annihilated. The Zelthar attacked 3 days into their first deployment. It wasn't even a full assault, just a scouting raid. A handful of sleek, angular ships slipped out of warp, darting through the void with terrifying speed. Union officers scrambled to execute the pre-approved countermeasure, designated Tactic 14C. Hold formation, fire in controlled volleys, and wait for Central Command to analyze the situation. Elias knew that was a bad idea. 6 seconds before the first Union ship exploded, the Zelthar did not wait for carefully aimed volleys. They zigzagged through the formation, exploiting gaps in the Union's rigid structure, slicing through hulls like hot knives through butter. "Hold position," barked Captain Jorvax, a reptilian officer whose idea of flexibility was deciding which side of his face to glare from. "With all due respect, sir," Elias said, hands flying across his console, "that's a terrible idea." Jorvax turned to snarl at him. But Elias had already opened a channel to the other human officers. Break formation. Immediately. That's against protocol. One of the ensigns hesitated. So is dying in the first 5 minutes. That got them moving. The Renegade peeled away from the formation, followed by a few other human-piloted vessels. The Union fleet held firm, firing slow, deliberate shots at enemies that weren't there anymore. The Zelthar zipped through them, picking them apart ship by ship. Meanwhile, Elias and his crew adapted. They ducked, weaved, and counterattacked, with unpredictability the enemy hadn't planned for. It worked. Within minutes, their small breakaway fleet had taken down 2 enemy ships and forced the rest to retreat. The battle should have been a disaster. Instead, the humans were the only ones left standing, and the Union was furious. The debriefing was tense. Admiral Vorsk loomed over Elias. 4 eyes narrowed. "You disobeyed protocol," he said. "We won. You deviated from the designated response pattern. We won because we deviated." Vorsk's nostrils flared. "This behavior is unacceptable." Elias clenched his jaw. "Sir, if we hadn't broken formation, we'd be floating debris right now. Better to die with discipline than to win through chaos." Elias stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. That was when he realized the Union truly believed their tactics weren't the problem. They thought the problem was humans thinking for themselves. That night, Elias sat in the Renegade's dimly lit command deck, staring at the battle logs. The evidence was clear. If humanity wanted to survive this war, they couldn't rely on the Union. They had to fight their way. The Union had given them the knowledge, the weapons, the ships, but they'd also made a mistake. They had taught humans how to wage war in space, and humanity was about to show them what that really meant. The first official reprimand landed on Elias's desk before he even had a chance to enjoy his coffee. He sighed, rubbing his temples as he scanned the report. Commander Elias Rourke, charged with gross insubordination, deviation from Union battle doctrine, and unauthorized tactical improvisation. They made thinking sound like a war crime. Across from him, Lieutenant Carter, one of the few other humans aboard the Renegade, snorted. "I love how they act like saving their asses was rude." Elias tossed the datapad onto the table. "Next time, we'll be sure to die politely." That's the spirit. The door swished open, and Captain Jorvax stormed in, his scaled face an impressive shade of angry green. "Commander Rourke," he growled, slamming a fist onto the table. "Your reckless disregard for procedure nearly destabilized the entire fleet." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You mean the fleet that got blown up?" Jorvax's eye twitched. "That is not the point." Carter leaned back in his chair, grinning. "I feel like it should be the point, though." Jorvax inhaled through his nostrils like a dragon trying not to roast the peasants. "You humans are unpredictable, chaotic, and dangerous. Your blatant disobedience cannot be tolerated." Elias folded his arms. "So what's the punishment? Do we have to sit through more efficiency training?" Jorvax's scaly lips curled. "Worse. The High Command has decided you will receive additional education." Carter nudged Elias. Translation: "They're gonna retrain us. I bet they make us write, 'I will not improvise in battle' 1,000 times on a whiteboard." Elias sighed. "Wonderful. I love mandatory brainwashing sessions." Jorvax straightened. "You are to report to Admiral Vorsk at once. He will ensure that your impulses are corrected." That sounded ominous, but Elias had learned something valuable. When an alien military command wanted you to stop thinking, that usually meant you were onto something. And if the Union thought humans were unpredictable before, they were in for a surprise. Admiral Vorsk's re-education session was exactly as painful as Elias had predicted. "War," Vorsk droned, pacing in front of a giant tactical holomap, "is a matter of statistical probability, not instinct. The Xelthar's chaotic methods may seem effective, but they are ultimately unsustainable." Elias stifled a yawn. "Uh-huh. Tell that to the planets they've conquered." Vorsk shot him a glare. "Your previous engagement was anomaly. Statistical models indicate that deviation from Union doctrine results in a 94.7% likelihood of failure, Carter whispered. Cool. Let's focus on the 5.3% where we don't die. Elias smirked. Admiral, with all due respect, we don't have time to sit around waiting for the enemy to fit into your models. Vorsk's eye twitched. This is why humans are dangerous. You lack discipline. Your actions are based on emotion, not logic. Elias leaned forward. And yet here we are, alive. Meanwhile, your logical approach has been getting fleets vaporized for 20 years. The room fell silent. Vorsk's nostrils flared. You are dismissed. As Elias and Carter left, the lieutenant whispered, That went, well? Yeah, Elias muttered. If by well you mean we're probably getting thrown out an airlock soon. But to his surprise, no airlocks opened under his feet. In fact, something unexpected happened. That night, a group of junior officers from various Union species, Thalaxians, Valurians, even a grumpy Corthan engineer, approached Elias in the mess hall. One of them, a Valurian with sleek blue skin and a nervous expression, leaned in. Commander, Rourke, is it true that you ignored doctrine and still won? Elias glanced at Carter, then back at them. That's the rumor. A Thalaxian officer looked around as if making sure no superior officers were listening. We have been considering alternative approaches, quietly, but to question Union strategy is treasonous. Carter grinned. We prefer to call it creative survival. The Corthan engineer grumbled. The Zelthar don't follow rules. Maybe. We shouldn't either. Elias studied them. They were scared. But more importantly, they were curious. And that was dangerous. The moment someone asks if there's another way, they've already started thinking for themselves. Elias leaned forward. Tell you what, if you're really interested, meet us in the cargo bay at 0200. But if anyone asks, you were never here. By the time 0200 rolled around, the cargo bay was full. It wasn't just a handful of curious officers. It was dozens. Some were humans, but most were Union species who had seen the writing on the wall. Elias stood at the center, arms crossed. Let's be clear, this is not an official meeting. If High Command finds out, we're all in deep trouble. A young Valurian officer swallowed hard. Then why are we here? Elias gestured to the holomap. Because you're tired of dying for a doctrine that doesn't work. The room was silent. Carter stepped forward. Look, I get it. Union tactics have been around for centuries, but the Zelthar don't care about that. They adapt, they improvise, they break every rule in the book. The Corthan engineer grunted. So, we do the same? Exactly, Elias said. We stop fighting like the Union. We fight like humans. A Thalaxian officer frowned. And what does that mean? Elias grinned. It means surprising the enemy, hitting them where they least expect, fighting dirty if we have to. Another officer hesitated. That sounds dishonorable. Carter shrugged. So is getting blown up because your battle manual says please stand still. A few chuckles rippled through the group. Elias leaned against a crate. Look, I'm not saying we overthrow the Union or start a rebellion. I'm saying we stop, waiting for some bureaucrat 100 light years away to approve our survival. We train ourselves. We come up with our own tactics. And when the next battle comes, he let the words hang. The Corthan engineer cracked his knuckles. We win. The room was silent for a long moment, then one by one heads nodded. Elias smiled. The Union thought humans were a problem before. They had no idea what was coming. The first sign that things were getting out of hand came when the Union's battle report started using the phrase unexpected human interference more often than actual enemy movements. Elias leaned against the command console, sipping his coffee as Captain Jorvax read aloud the latest report with growing horror. Fleet Sigma engaged the Zelthar at Outpost 17, Jorvax muttered. Human officers took unauthorized tactical liberties. Outcome, Zelthar fleet destroyed, Union doctrine ignored. His voice rose. Again, Elias shrugged. You're welcome. Jorvax's eye twitched. You humans are undermining the Union's strategic integrity. Carter, sitting nearby, smirked. I think the term you're looking for is winning. Jorvac slammed his fists onto the table. That is not the point. Elias took another sip. It feels like the point. The captain growled, his scales darkening. Your reckless anarchy is spreading. Officers from other species are now following your lead. Do you understand how dangerous this is? Carter leaned in. Yeah, for the Zelthar. Jorvac threw his arms up. Admiral Vorsk has demanded an inquiry. He believes human influence is becoming a contagion. Elias raised an eyebrow. Oh no, not competence, the Union's greatest fear. Jorvac exhaled sharply. If this continues, the High Command may take drastic measures to contain this insubordination. Carter grinned. Contain us? We're not the problem. The problem is that Union tactics were written by people who think adaptability is a war crime. Jorvac looked like he wanted to hurl them both into deep space. Do not make light of this, Commander. The Union is a carefully structured system, and humans, he jabbed a finger at Elias, are not following the program. Elias met his gaze. Maybe the program needs to change. Jorvac went rigid, as if Elias had suggested the Union replace their battle manuals with fortune cookies. The silence stretched. Then, without another word, Jorvac stormed out. Carter watched him go, then turned to Elias. So, on a scale, from mild inconvenience to full-scale purge, how bad do you think this is? Elias exhaled. We're definitely past mild inconvenience. It got worse fast. A week later, Union High Command issued an official directive banning unauthorized human-led tactical deviations. Any officer caught disrupting battle protocol would be relieved of duty. In other words, stop thinking or else. The problem? By now, nobody was listening. The new strategies weren't just working, they were spreading. It wasn't just human officers ignoring doctrine anymore. It was Thalaxian gunners choosing better firing positions. Valyrian pilots breaking formation to dodge enemy fire. Even a Korthan battleship captain admitted that Union-approved retreat vectors were stupid and did the opposite instead. The rise. Zelthar started losing. Badly. And the Union hated it. Elias knew things had really spiraled when he got a classified transmission from Admiral Vorsk himself. The Admiral's holographic face flickered into existence, looking like he had aged. A decade in the last 2 weeks. Commander Rourke. Elias saluted lazily. Sir. Vorsk's jaw tightened. I do not appreciate your influence over the fleet. Elias tilted his head. My influence? You mean the part where we win battles? Vorsk's voice dropped into dangerous territory. The Union is built on order. It cannot function if officers act independently. Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. So you'd rather lose as long as it's by the book? Vorsk's expression barely flickered, but Elias knew a hit when he landed. One. After a long pause, the Admiral leaned forward. You misunderstand the situation, Commander. The issue is not victory. The issue is control. Elias stilled. There it was. They weren't afraid of the Zelthar. They were afraid of losing control over their own people. Vorsk exhaled. If you continue down this path, the consequences will be severe. Elias's grip tightened around his cup. Is that a threat, Admiral? Vorsk didn't answer. He didn't need to. The transmission cut out. Carter, who had been listening from the doorway, let out a low whistle. Well, that was subtle. Elias exhaled. They're scared. Carter smirked. Yeah, of us. 2 days later, the Renegade got new orders. They weren't being sent to reinforce the front. They were being recalled to Union command. Elias read the message twice, then turned to Carter. They're pulling us out. Carter frowned. But the war's still, oh. His eyes narrowed. They don't want us fighting. They want us gone. Elias nodded grimly. They're cutting us out before we infect the whole fleet. Carter crossed his arms. So what's the plan? Go quietly? Elias's lips curled. Not a chance in hell. He turned to the bridge crew, most of whom had already abandoned Union doctrine in favor of staying alive. New orders just came in, he said casually. Union command wants us to head home. The Corthan engineer snorted. Define home, because if you mean back to high command, that's a no from me. Valurian pilot Marek leaned back in his chair. We could just not follow orders. Elias gave him a slow grin. I like the way you think. Carter clapped his hands. All right, so instead of flying back like good little soldiers, we do what? Elias tapped the holomap. We stay in the fight. Marek raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting desertion. Wrong, Elias said. I'm suggesting continued active duty in a way that Union High Command will find deeply inconvenient. The Corthan engineer cracked his knuckles. I'm in. Carter slung an arm around Elias. Man, I love when you get rebellious. Elias smirked. All right then, set course for the next battle zone. Marek input the coordinates. And when High Command realizes we ignored orders? Elias stretched. They'll be really mad. Carter grinned. And when they try to stop us? Elias's eyes gleamed. Then they'll finally understand why teaching humans how to fight was the worst mistake they ever made. The first sign that the Galactic Union was in real trouble wasn't the growing list of military defeats or the fact that half its fleet was ignoring direct orders. No, the first sign was a memo. A very panicked memo. Elias Rourke, now the unofficial commander of a very officially rogue fleet, sat in his chair aboard the Renegade, skimming through the latest transmission intercepted from Union High Command. Carter leaned over his shoulder reading along. Emergency session, addressing the human tactical crisis, urgent discussion on growing insubordination and the destabilization of Union authority. Priority, immediate containment. Carter snorted. Containment, huh? That's adorable. Elias smirked, tossing the tablet onto the console. They're flailing. They're scared, Marek, the Valurian pilot, added, lounging in his chair. And they should be. Their own officers are ignoring them. Not just officers, the Corthan engineer chimed in. Whole fleets are defecting. I just got a message from Admiral Thrask. He's refusing to follow recall orders. Carter grinned. Man, I love Thrask. He's like a war rhino with a grudge. Elias cracked his knuckles. All right, let's make this official. He turned to the holocom. Patch me through to every non-compliant ship. It's time we stop pretending we're part of the Union and start acting like what we really are. Carter's grin widened. An insurgency? Elias shook his head. A rebellion. The moment the transmission went out, the war stopped being about the Zelthar. It became humans versus the Union. Union High Command did not handle it well. At first they tried to reason with the defectors. This was hilarious, considering their version of reasoning involved phrases like re-education and reintegration protocols. Then they tried threats. Any ship failing to report back will be classified as hostile. Elias had responded with a single-word transmission. Noted. That's when the Union panicked and sent an entire battle fleet to force compliance. It didn't go well. For them. By now, human-led tactics had infected the entire war effort. Valurians were ignoring their recommended flight formations. Thalaxian strategists were actually thinking instead of following playbooks written a century ago. Even the Corthan dreadnought captains, a species famous for their blind loyalty, were telling Union command to get bent. The battle lasted 5 hours, the Union's fleet ceased to exist, and the Zelthar? They just sat back and watched. Because, suddenly, this wasn't their war anymore. The final collapse happened so fast it was almost embarrassing. With its fleets in open rebellion, the Galactic Union scrambled to maintain order. Planetary governors resigned. Military bases stopped answering calls. The bureaucrats, those slimy, entitled officials who had never seen combat, fled to neutral space stations, hoping to wait out the storm. Meanwhile, Elias and his fleet kept pushing forward, taking over one strategic point after another. By the time they reached Union Prime, the once mighty heart of galactic governance, They weren't met with resistance. They were met with white flags. Elias stood on the bridge, arms crossed, watching as the Union's High Chancellor, the most powerful politician in the galaxy, broadcasted his formal surrender. To all citizens of the Galactic Union, the man swallowed. We have come to an understanding with the human-led forces. Effective immediately, all centralized command operations will be, he hesitated, restructured. Carter leaned over. That's a fancy way of saying we lost. Elias smirked. Sure is. The broadcast ended. The war was over. And just like that, the Galactic Union was no more. Elias sat on the Renegade's observation deck staring out at the stars. A chair scraped beside him as Carter sat down, beer in hand. So, Elias echoed. Carter took a sip. We just toppled the biggest government in the galaxy. Yup. There was a pause. Carter turned. What the hell do we do now? Elias exhaled. Well, someone's got to run things. Carter groaned. Oh, hell no. If I wanted responsibility, I wouldn't have joined the military in the first place. Marek wandered over, smirking. Well, you do have a fleet that technically follows you now. Might as well make it official. Elias raised an eyebrow. Official what? Marek grinned. How does Commander Rourke, Supreme Leader of the New Galactic Order, sound? Elias barked out a laugh. Absolutely not. Carter nudged him. Come on, admit it. You'd look great on propaganda posters. Hard pass. Marek shrugged. Fine, but someone's gotta keep the peace or this whole thing falls apart. Elias sighed. Yeah, I know. Carter grinned. So what's our first order of business, oh fearless leader? Elias looked back at the stars, a slow smile spreading across his face. First? He stood up, stretching. We throw a hell of a party. Carter whooped. Now that's leadership I can get behind. And just like that, the humans, former foot soldiers of an empire that had once thought them insignificant, became the architects of a new galaxy. The Galactic Union's biggest mistake? They taught humans how to fight, and humans never lose.